if you have a problem, she's always the person that we're supposed to go to fix it. So, I mean, hey, you're a better man than I am. Love you.
Thank you, Tony. Are we on? Test? Test? Yes, I'm on. Thank you. Couldn't hear myself. But I can't hear myself a lot of times, and that's good. What a wonderful song. There is no place for hate when there is unconditional love. And you know that's what we teach here, unconditional love. This morning I'll be talking about the invisible faces of racism. And I said that, and I kind of titled that way because, it's many of the faces of racism, the faces of bigotry, because it goes beyond that, we see. And today in America, thank goodness, there are more people who step up and step out when those things occur in our society. And you see that, you've heard it, you've talked, we talk about it. But mostly today, I want to talk about what I call the invisible face of racism. Those faces that sometimes get us confused. There's a little story about Nat King Cole. How many people know who Nat King Cole is? Oh, that's pretty good. There were 3 people who didn't raise their hands, so I'll tell you later. But anyway, he was the first really big African-American recording artist who was nationally acclaimed as such, who had a national television program. And he was very successful. So in 1948, he purchased this beautiful home in a pretty plush Los Angeles neighborhood. When the local folks found out, their association officers went to see him and confront him before he moved in. And they informed him that they did not want any undesirables to move in. And so he looked at them and he thought for a second. He said, "Neither do I. If I see any coming in here, I'll be the first to complain." He lived in that house until his death in 1965. He was a catalyst for change. Most of us did not know that at the time, but that's what he really was. Somebody said that if all of us woke up tomorrow morning and we all looked alike, we had the same color, we all were identical in many ways, by nightfall, there would be a group of people who would come together to still tell us what our differences are and to point it out, right? So it doesn't have anything to do with skin color. It has everything to do with differences that we perceive and illusions that we perceive about those differences. When I lived in New Jersey for a number of years, outside of New York City, I found that to be the most segregated place I've ever lived in. I was born and raised in Newport News, Virginia. But New Jersey and New York was unbelievable. I mean, you didn't live in certain communities if you were Puerto Rican. You didn't live in certain communities if you were white. You didn't live in certain communities if you were African American. You didn't live in certain communities if you weren't Puerto Rican. And it went on and on. Jewish communities. It was so segregated to the point that their clubs, even their businesses sometimes, really didn't want anybody different in the door. Now, I think that's opened up a lot today. But I found it pretty curious to me from the standpoint that I had been brought in an area where we were segregated, and we were at the time when I was a child. And thank God that has changed a lot over the years. And racism is not, it's still quite a challenge, but it's not the same challenge it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago, or even 50 years ago. One of the things that I have realized over time is that we all have our blind spots. And my blind spot is not obvious to me, but it is to you. Your blind spot is not obvious to you, but it is to others. And it doesn't mean it's a negative, a good, or bad thing. It's just the fact that we have different blind spots about ourselves. Let me give you an example. When I was in seminary, one of the questions that was asked of us is, "Are you a racist?" in a class that we took. And most of us said, "No, I'm not a racist." And then they showed us this video. And that video said to Richard Bunch, "You are a racist." Because the video was outlining the difference in a discussion by a number of people between what we would call white privilege and that lack of privilege for others of different races, different countries, different nationalities. They were all Americans, but they weren't accepted as such. And what I found out about myself that I think I've gotten away from somewhat, and I'm still a racist, all of us are still racist in some concept. That doesn't mean it's bad, it just means it is, and we need to work on it. But what I learned about myself was that I thought everybody, if they would do it like I did it, they would be fine. If you'll go get a good education, you'll get a great job. And back then, white people could do that. If you will work out your problems like I work out my problems through the social justice system or through the justice system, that everything will be fine. If you just do what Richard did, you'll become successful. Do you see how racist that is? Because what I'm not taking into consideration, and what I didn't take into consideration, is that even though I worked hard, another person could work hard, but the same doors would not open for them that opened for me. It's a difference. And I had to accept that about myself and look at that. And now, when I am talking with folks of different colors, of different races, of different nationalities, and it can be nationalities, by the way, the Irish and the English don't live in the same neighborhood, for example. When I am talking with people, I try to keep that in mind, that I did come from a background where there was this white primacy that said, indirectly, if you do it like we do it, then everything will be fine. And that's not true. I know that today. Because everything isn't truly equal. All the doors aren't open to everybody that were open to me. But that doesn't mean I don't need to work at that and help those doors open, and you and I can do that together. You know, nobody automatically thinks of themselves as being in bondage to prejudice. Not even the fiercest member of the most radical white supremacy group would admit to such, certainly not openly. You and I may see their blind spot, but they don't see it. What they think, many times, is that all we're doing is you're showing fully the difference between people. All we're doing is saying that we are proud of our identity, and we shouldn't mix them together. And they'll even quote the Bible sometime to prove that. A misquote, but they use it. Much like was used for slavery. Much like is being used even today for homosexuals. Using Scripture to prove what is not unconditional love, but is limited to what they call love, but it's not really love. There's a barrier. And anytime there's a barrier, things start to break down. You see, since racism really wears so many disguises, all of them somewhat attractive and comfortable, just being who we are when we're in the human condition, not in the following the principles that unity teaches, not being one and being that image of God, being that manifestation of God, demonstrating what God is in love and wisdom and understanding and compassion. When we're not there, what happens is there is this force within us that makes us more comfortable when we're with people who are like us, who think like us. Now, one of the beauties of unity is that we are all like-minded, we say. And we really aren't. We just think we are. We each have a little different opinion of certain things. And it's okay. That's good. That's the diversity. But it doesn't mean that we're all alike. It means that we can come together and discuss things so we can become more alike. We can open up our hearts. We can release from ourselves that invisible racism that still exists at certain levels. In some ways, this is a simple issue. and in many ways it's very complex. It's simple because we know in our hearts what's right and what's wrong. We don't have to figure that out very hard. We know when we're not using unconditional love as the cornerstone. We know when Christians are doing more harm than good because of their views on racism. We know when we are not manifesting that which God manifests through us, or can manifest through us. And since we know that, what we have this opportunity to do is change it. But we have to examine ourselves and our belief systems. And we have to admit that there is all kinds of racism. There is racism in the Anglo community when I was growing up, right? Because I thought rednecks weren't quite as good as I was. I really believe that. I didn't agree with some of the things they thought or said. And I used to judge them really good in college. I was really good at that. And I hope I'm gotten away from that. And in the black community, we know there's some racism from the standpoint of how black you are or how light you are. There is racism in the white and black community, how educated you are or aren't. There is racism in both communities over where you live or don't live. And so it is there alive within us at some degree. And to each person in here, it's a different degree. You are not the norm, I don't think. Because we are here together in this diversified and inclusive relationship. There's a story in the Bible about Brother Peter, the disciple. Now Peter is an interesting guy. Remember, he's the guy who denied that he was a follower and apostle of Jesus when Jesus was being crucified. He also is the guy who came out as the leader of the church, certainly the Jerusalem church for a while. He and Paul would go head to head from time to time. But Peter, as it's related in Acts, went to Joppa. And in Joppa, he was visiting with this friend of his, and he went into a fast. Now, fasting can do weird things to you. And what it did for Peter is he went up on the roof to rest. He had this vision. And he didn't know that this vision had something to do with what was going to happen next to him, which I'll explain. And the vision basically was that, to simplify it, that God presented to him in a vision a banquet. But Peter had to prepare the banquet. And on this banquet table, just to keep it simple, was a pig, was bacon, was food that had not been cleansed by the rabbi. It wasn't kosher. And that day and time, a good Jew, even a good Christian Jew, did not partake of those foods. And so here he has this vision, and God's saying, now kill it and eat it. And Peter's saying, wait a minute, God, do you understand that I'm one of the good guys? That I'm Jewish? Do you understand that that's all unclean? And God says to Peter, anything I have created is not unclean. It is all clean. Now, Peter can't figure out why in the world did I have this vision. And what happened was, the next day, there's a fellow by the name of Cornelius. He was an Italian guy from Rome, okay? Wasn't well thought of. He was not at the high level that the Jewish folks felt he should be. He was unclean in their eyes. And he sent one of his couriers to ask Peter to come to his house and to spend time with him, because he was a man of God and wanted to learn more about this person, Jesus. And so what happens is that Peter goes. And when he gets there, he stops for a moment and he shares this statement. You yourselves know how unlawful it is for a Jew to associate with or to visit anyone of another nation. But God has shown me that I should not call any person common or unclean. What a revelation. What a revelation. To put it in context with the world we live in today, certainly in the United States, then what it might say is something like this. God did not create African Americans as unclean. This is what a white person might have to learn. God did not create Latinos as unclean. And imagine you went to somebody's house and said, well, I've always considered you to be unclean, but today I don't think you are. Wouldn't that be a wonderful way to start dinner? Might be a little fearful, that one, okay? But anyway, that's what Peter said to them. So put it in the context of today. And then what happened is that Peter worked with these guys and taught them the message of Jesus as he understood it. And he went back to Jerusalem. Now, when he got back to Jerusalem, there was a political party in the Christian church called the Circumcision Party. Circumcision Party said you got to be circumcised to be clean. And they got hold of Peter. And they said to Peter, what are you doing? They are unclean. What are you doing taking the gospel to them? And Peter said, well, I had this vision, and God said. And in this case, he didn't deny anything. He said, God said this is the way it is. And what happened was he started to side with Paul, who did not believe that the Gentiles had to be circumcised in order to be Christians. It was a big battle back then. See how it started? I mean, right there is an example of how this stuff continues on into our societies, in our hearts and our minds sometimes, without even knowing it. That blind spot. And so what happened is, again, that Peter stood his ground. Now, there was another time he didn't do quite as well. So sometimes, that old idea that we get it, and we live with it a while, and then circumstances change, and maybe we don't quite get it the same way, and we don't practice it the same way. Because he was in Antioch with Paul, and he was meeting with some folks who were Gentiles. He had some other Christians, he had some other Jewish folks with him. The Jewish folks were saying, Peter, we're not supposed to meet with them. We're not supposed to eat with them. So Peter had to give up his bacon and lettuce and tomato sandwich, okay, and back off, and he started to agree with the Jewish folks who were there. And Paul came in and said, you are a hypocrite. You said everybody is unclean. He pointed it out to Peter, and then Peter finally said, you're right. I am wrong. And so sometimes the blind spot, has to be pointed out to us. You see, what we're talking about, and what Peter was talking about, and what this story talks about, is racial reconciliation. It talks about how we feel in our hearts, and how do we see others through the Christ that's within them. Do we see the Christ within them when they agree with us? Do we see the Christ within them when they look like us? Do we see the Christ within them when they act like us? That's easy. Jesus said, love your enemies. Do good to who persecute you. Metaphysically, what I think it says is that I have believed, and others believe, that certain kinds of people are our enemies, and they aren't. And so we do good when we're willing to get to know them, when we're willing to open our hearts and our minds to other people. The temple in Jerusalem had several doors. One of the doors were for Jewish women who were considered to be clean to come through, and they could sit and be and worship in the temple. But they could only go in that door, and they could only go in that section of the temple. They did not meet with the men. Then there was one for the Gentiles, believe it or not, where Gentiles who were God-fearing, who were looking for God, could go and sit in that room. And yet, there was another room, which is the intersanctum, where Jewish men only could go. And then there was one beyond that where only the priest goes, where the Holy of Holies met. Archaeologists found not long ago in this structure this kind of verbiage. And over the wall where women and Gentiles walked in, it says, whoever is captured past this point will have himself to blame for his subsequent death. If you try to go in this other room, don't blame us if we kill you. Whew, kind of tough language, isn't it? We wouldn't accept that today. But that's the way it was thought about. Again, suppose we have in our hearts an idea that says if you are a black male, and this used to exist in this country, and it still does to some, if you are a black male, you climb this wall and you will have only yourself to blame for your death. If you are a Latino, climb this wall and you will only have yourself to blame for your death. If you're Asian, brother, climb this wall and you will only have yourself to blame for your own foolishness, for your death. Can't even imagine that, can you? But you know what? Sometimes we build the wall, not of physical violence, not of death, but not willing to walk over and get to know the other people. We're not willing to come one-to-one, heart-to-heart, mind-to-mind. What that part of the Bible is teaching is that we are all truly one. Now, in the Bible, Greek, there are two words for one. In this case, the word was kainos. And kainos means, properly defined, means a kind, a new kind, unprecedented, novel, uncommon, unheard of. Now I want you to put it in this context, though. A 2015 Ford Explorer is not a new idea, but the Model T was. The cotton gin was a new idea. The telegraph was a new idea. You see, that is a new idea. And what they're talking about in this oneness is a new way of being one. And that's what we're doing. We are a new way of being one. Most of us know that the most segregated place on a Sunday morning is in the church, right? Yeah, it is. And what a shame. There was a guy who, and I forgot, Michael Chaplin, I think his name is. Anyway, he was in Texas. And what he noticed, there was a great football stadium in the town that he was in. I think it was A&M. And the church was huge. And the church had this wonderful parking lot that they let people park in when they went to the ball game. And on Saturday, when they had the ball game, he would notice, as a young man, that every kind of person you could name was at that parking there. That it was, African American, it was poor, it was wealthy, it was anybody who could get in and park there. There was no discrimination. And yet, on Sunday morning, they were 100% white, fairly wealthy, dressed properly, coming to that church. As a young man, he decided that what he wanted to do was change that. Eventually, he became the minister and the pastor of that church. And today, they have a diverse group of people. They are no longer that image of what that Baptist church thought they should be. And that's good. Things have changed. But he was the catalyst behind that because he had an understanding of the change that was needed. The other thing that he said that I thought made so much sense, and I just bring to you to weigh in your heart and look at, is, are we just diversified when we sit here on Sunday morning, or are we diversified in our relationships? When I walk out of here, are all my friends look like me and act like me? Now, I know that's not true of a lot of you because I know the work that you do together, and I know you have relationships with one another. But in your heart, in your mind, just weigh that a little bit. And I'm not saying you're bad. I'm not saying you're a racist if you have that situation. But here's what we can do. We can change it. When we were in El Paso, our church went from 25% Hispanic to 75% Hispanic. It went from 75% Anglo to about 20% or maybe 15% Anglo. And it went from about 5% to 10% African American. And what we noticed is that when they went to Fellowship Hall, the African Americans sat here, the Hispanics sat here, or Latinos sat here, and the whites sat here. And so what I did is I started to mention that as an observation. And the way I would do it is say, this morning, why don't you sit with somebody different so you can get to know them? And that started to happen. And then they started inviting people to their homes. Now, you see, when we really get to know somebody in a different culture, a different race, it can be uncomfortable. An example. When Vicki and I were in El Paso, we were invited to a party that some Hispanic folks gave whose parents had come from Mexico. We were invited to show up at the party at 3 o'clock. And what do two white people do? They show up at 3:10. And let me tell you, that was 2 hours early. For that culture, we didn't know it. We had no idea. What they do is they say, you can come starting at 3 o'clock if you want to, but if you come, you better get ready to help us make the food and do this and do that, okay? And so we pitched in with that. And then about 5 o'clock, 5:30, people started flowing in, and they filled the house. And Vicki and I are now getting ready to leave because we have another engagement. You see, we felt uncomfortable. We were surprised. But we learned something from it about that culture. And so I asked them about it later. I didn't just go, okay, I just asked them. They said, yeah, that's the common thing. And we really appreciate you coming over early and helping us out. I said, the next time we'll come at 5. No, anyway. But you see, sometimes we find ourselves, when we're people who are different upbringing, people who have experienced life differently, uncomfortable. If you feel that, and it's only in your heart you can know that, I recommend that you get to know a person who is different than you. I recommend that you sit down and really get to know them and talk with them and find out what you have in common, because you have a lot more in common than the differences. When I was a licensed Baptist minister, I used to go to the black churches in Newport News. And one minister, Baptist minister, said, what are you doing that? What's the matter with you? Don't you know that's not where you should be? And I said, well, I wanted to learn. This was the minister I was listening to every Sunday. I wanted to learn to speak better. I wanted to learn because I think they are fantastic the way they deliver a message. And I did learn that. I could get into the cadence and that type of thing a little bit. But you see, here's the minister who's saying you shouldn't do that. And I don't think that he hated anybody. I think he was a very loving man. I know he was. But there was the blind spot. I can't learn from those folks. And so we need to open ourselves up and say, how can I learn from every brother and sister, because we are all one. In closing, there's an email I want to share with you. It wasn't sent to me. Well, there's two of them. One that was sent to me. The first one was sent to a black pastor in this church I was talking about. And so, and Michael is not an African American. And what happened was, this black pastor shared his time one evening, was invited for dinner one evening in a home. And he got this email. And it said, we were glad to have you over. After you left that night, Spencer, who was the son, wanted to talk to me. He told me that all the people we've met with really dark skin seem really, really cool. And I'd really like to have a younger brother who is black. It would seem that you are making a good impression on my children, he said. In fact, he prays every night that we would adopt a kid to fit his mental picture, a little younger than him, maybe 7 or 8, and black. That's what's happening. That's why it takes some time for this to work. Our children are changing if we set the right example for them. If we make sure that if something comes up that's negative, that can be racist or derogatory in nature, that we correct it with them and with others around them. And that takes some courage. I know that. And so, the other thing is that I got an email from Pat Churchill. And Pat has her doctorate from Harvard. That was pretty impressive to me. I mean, I knew that, but it was still impressive when she wrote it to me. And she had a dissertation she had to do. And it was called The Theory of Transformational Convergences. The Theory of Transformational Convergences. And what it was about is how American society was moving toward, this is a very positive essay, was moving toward equal rights for homosexuals. This is 1993. Freedom from oppression for African Americans, and freedom for American Indians without any reservations. And boy, we could spend some time on American Indians and that story, because we haven't been told the truth about it in history. We're just learning. But anyway, she did that. And she said in her email, Richard, it's not happening as quickly as I thought it was, but it is happening step by step. And it is happening step by step. But you and I can be the difference by being an example. You and I can be the difference by saying, I got a blind spot and I want to get rid of it. You and I can be the difference by reaching out with true love from our hearts and wanting to be with one another in relationship, not just in this pew. Oh, we don't have pews anymore. Not just in the chair. Okay? So just hold that in your hearts and hold that in your minds. And just know that we have so many wonderful relationships here. We have the team called Race Matters. What I dream of for that team, and they're doing great work in discussion, but what I dream of that current team is there will be people of all different races, people of different cultures, all sitting together and talking. It's not just a black-white issue. And so I invite you, and they're having a session this afternoon at 12:30. I invite you to come to that and share and listen. You can discuss what you disagree with what I said. It's okay to do that there, okay? And so anyway, I just invite you to that. So I just give thanks for this church, for the relationships that are here, and for those that are growing. No matter who the people are, we know that we're all one. We are all truly one. There is no one that is unclean in the eyes of God. Thank you. Okay.